Thank you so much for taking the time today to come and join us. We do appreciate it, and we hope and we're quite sure that you'll get a lot from this online workshop today. Both Lisa Bridle and myself will be presenting, but I'll do a formal introduction after I do my acknowledgement of country, which we always like to begin with. So I'd like to acknowledge the First Nations people as the traditional owners of the land on which we stand here today in South Brisbane. I recognise the country north and south of the Brisbane River as the home of both the Turrbal and the Jagera nations. I pay deep respects to the elders, past, present and future. All right, so a formal welcome to all of those who have joined us so far, and no doubt we'll have some more pop in as we begin this session. I'm Ainsley. I might be a bit of a new face to many of you. I have in recent months, joined CREW as a consultant with the Families for Inclusive Education team. And I have been interacting with CREW though for several years now, because I'm also a mum of 2 children with disability. I have a daughter who is 15 and a son who is 12, both with disability and both in regular schools. And I've got a background in education as a teacher and specialised with working with children with learning disabilities over the last 5 years. And of course, presenting with me today is Lisa Bridle. I'll let Lisa wheel on over because we're trying to keep our distance.
So yes, we're social distancing within with the chairs on wheels. So I'm Lisa. I've worked at CREW now for more than 10 years, and a previous stint prior to that. I have a son, Sean, who's 25, and so I've been learning and very passionate about inclusive education for the last 25 years, which is kind of scary. And I'll talk a little bit about how I was involved in the original production of I Choose Inclusion a little bit later.
So first we'll be exploring the legitimacy of family advocacy and core advocacy principles. Tips for school meetings, which is always very handy. Facing the crowd when you're experiencing obstacles to inclusion. And keeping your vision strong despite the barriers. We like to put some of the quotes from parents who've been interacting with CREW for quite a while at the bottom of our slides. So I'll read this one out because it pertains to our breakout rooms which are about to happen. The best advice I can give is to stay connected to people who value your goals and who will support you in pursuing your dreams. For me, knowing other parents who were choosing inclusion were a little bit further down the track has been gold. I know that's certainly been gold for me. So I'll just check if Lisa's ready over here, and we're going to give you a chance to introduce yourself and have a little chat within your breakout rooms.
So basically, I Choose Inclusion was a really fun project because we managed to collect all of the wisdom of families from across Queensland. So we'd actually done a survey of families, and many families contributed. And I think it was a time where we could come together with dark humour to reflect on what it takes to stay on the inclusive education path.
So when people are heading out to schools, we like for them to have a good head around what inclusion is, and that's where the I Choose Inclusion starts, with getting people's head around what authentic inclusion should look, sound and feel like. So within the book that's described in detail, but a good summary is here on this slide, that inclusive education means that all students can attend and are welcomed by their neighbourhood schools in age-appropriate regular classes. Students are supported to learn, contribute and participate in all aspects of school life. And it's not just about physical inclusion, it's about social inclusion and curriculum inclusion as well. Also, we like for parents to have a good understanding of why inclusive education is important for their child. I think most here today would probably say, well, I know it gives my child the best chance of having a good life, of being known by the community, but it's also important that parents have their head around a little bit the research that is available, because there's now 5 decades of research available to parents. Now, that doesn't mean that you need to go off reading all sorts of documents and searching the internet, because there's some excellent tools that are available for you. And in the I Choose Inclusion Toolkit book, we've listed some of the newest and latest research findings, where there's all that research has actually been summarised for you. So 2 key documents there are the Alana summary, which is an overseas one, and then we've got the Australian one there by Kathy Colligan. So we highly recommend you have a look, not just at the I Choose Inclusion book and the pages there about why inclusive education is important, but also having a look through those reviews. They're not too hefty, and it's just good to have all that in hand at your fingertips where it's needed as you advocate for your child. And it's also good to know that inclusion's not just good for your child, but it is shown by evidence and research to be good for everybody, for the teachers and the other children in the school. Also important as you're advocating for your child is to know that there is a lot of support for schools and for your child in regards to their inclusion. Again, in the toolkit, all these documents are explored, but it's important too to have your head around this as a parent. We have an excellent inclusion education policy here in Queensland, and we've got to be making sure that our schools are keeping up with it and making sure it's implemented. There's many resources now available for our schools to tap into. There's regional inclusion coaches, autism hub. There's much available, assistive technology. There's other things that we'd like you as a parent to start to get your head around in the terminology as well. Things like Universal Design for Learning, the NCCD. I think many of us are familiar with EAPs and individual plans. So there's information there in the toolkit, but there's also information here at CRU and on our website for you to find out more. Now I'm going to hand over to Lisa, who's going to talk about what is reasonable to expect.
Thanks, Ainsley. So this is kind of one of the things that was really important for us to capture in I Choose Inclusion, both back in 2011 and now, because I know as a parent, I would sometimes drive myself crazy thinking, am I being unreasonable? Am I asking too much? And so it was really important that we as parents came together and worked out what we thought was reasonable and researched actually from the Disability Standards for Education and other legislation what it was reasonable to expect. So the first was that schools provide access to all, that people couldn't say, I'm sorry, we can't provide your child physical access, we don't take kids like that, for example. It was reasonable for every parent to expect that their child would be welcomed, that you're able to enrol your child at the school of your choice. And that right has actually been strengthened with the new inclusive education policy. That your child could participate in learning for the same amount of time and be in the regular environment. So this meant, for example, that if part-time attendance at the school should only be something that is offered because it is really in the best interest of your child. It should be something that you as a parent request, not that that's the school's answer for a funding shortfall. And that we're talking about the student with disability being in the regular classroom with their same age peers, not shunted off into the special ed room and just a visitor to the regular school. It is reasonable for you as a parent to participate in meetings and to have positive conversations about accommodations. So it is an expectation of the education system that you are a legitimate stakeholder and you have an important perspective to be offered, rather than it's kind of the school's way or the highway. And finally, that your child will be safe. Now, all of these things are absolutely kind of enshrined in the Disability Standards for Education and in inclusive education policies. However, I want to acknowledge that many of you will have experienced a gap between these reasonable expectations and what happens. So gatekeeping into school is very common. It's very common for kids to be still segregated into special education environments and not in the regular classrooms for the same amount of time. And that reality is why we as parents need to be vigilant and active in our advocacy. So in I Choose Inclusion, we also looked at some of the things that it wasn't reasonable to expect. And one of that was that it's not reasonable to expect a full-time teacher aide most of the time. There would be some rare occasions where that is a reasonable adjustment for the child. And it's also not reasonable that you expect a lot of specialist support, except a lot of kind of one-on-one therapy, for example, within the regular environment. And we wouldn't normally think those things are desirable in any case. So it's, as I said, we don't get closer to closing that gap unless we as families become strong advocates for our family members. And that means embracing our natural authority. What does that mean? So this is a quote from a parent leader called Margaret Ward. She says, make 2 lists. In the first column, list all the people who've been constant in the life of your son and daughter. In the other column, list all the people who've come and gone over the same period. We once received a service from a family support organisation, and in 2 years we had 7 key workers. So that's kind of an example. You may have had the same experience. So your first list will likely be short, naming your family members, perhaps a few faithful friends or extended family. They are the people who can begin to claim some authority in your son or daughter's life. So I guess what that means, it doesn't mean that professionals, for example, educators, don't have a valuable perspective. What it does mean is that families need to claim their authority to say, I know my son or daughter best. I've known them more in their totality. You see them in lots of different environments. You understand their history, private health or medical information. And so you really have a valuable perspective, and it would be to your child's detriment not to claim that authority and not to claim that voice. I don't think that means that we always get it right. We don't know our kids in the school environment as well, so we need to listen to educators' perspective. But yeah, that's a really important thing that I learned, is that time and time again, people would try to steer me down a particular path, and I needed to think, if I go down that path, what is going to be the consequence for Sean in the long term, knowing that our family would be the ones to mop up that situation if systems got things wrong. So this is kind of an overview of some of the more essential or fundamental advocacy tips that are contained in I Choose Inclusion. And if you've been to Crew workshops, you will know we never leave a workshop without talking about the need to lead with a positive vision and a focus on our son and daughter's gifts. This, rather than problems and deficits, which has been the traditional disability story, is what gets us closer to where we want to be. Advocacy is a serious business. It doesn't mean that it's always a humorless business, but it is something that we need to approach with a certain level of seriousness, intent and strength. And that means that we must plan our advocacy, document what we want, anticipate challenges, and go into advocacy situations kind of in a business-like or organised manner. It's helpful for us to learn what good inclusion looks like. We need to be careful about what we ask for. I have seen, and I guess sometimes we talk here at Crew or in previous roles that I've had with families who would be asking for things which are actually against the evidence of what works in terms of inclusion for students with disability. And so I think it's really very helpful to be connected with other families, connected with organisations like CRU or other advocacy organisations to acquire that knowledge, so you're not asking for things that you'll need to undo in the future. So the example, without harping on that example of the teacher aide, I've seen many younger families ask for full-time teacher aides, and it's led to a situation where even if people don't get a full-time teacher aide, they get significant hours of teacher aide time and lots of one-on-one support, which actually creates a situation of learned helplessness and powerlessness in the child. So that's one thing I would ask people to be cautious about. And, really it is our role to share our knowledge of our child in as warm and non-confrontational way, but as assertively as possible, not to be kind of easily pushed aside. And finally, and this can be a hard one, to not take on all the problems that the school presents to you. And a really common one is that we still hear schools say, look, we'd really like to, but we just don't have the resources for that, or look, we're doing the best we can because, if we provided more, it would be really taking away from the other kind of students in the class. And really to be able to say, that's not our problem as a parent, that is the problem for the school system to be work out. So our role is to name what good inclusion looks like, to name what is in the best interests of our family member based on our knowledge of them, and to keep working with that vigilance and optimism towards their successful inclusion. So I'm going to hand back to Ainsley, and we're going to talk about school meetings.
Yes. As it comes to the midsection of the I Choose Inclusion Toolkit, it gets into the nitty-gritty, things like school meetings. So what we're going to ask now, and I'll just check with Lisa if we think we've got enough time to go into some very brief breakout rooms. We're going to let you just have a little natter as to what has worked for you in a school meeting and maybe what hasn't. And then we'll come back and we'll share some of the wisdom that's in the I Choose Inclusion booklet regarding school meetings. Here are some tips that we'd like to share with you today. So, be sure of the purpose before you go into the meeting. If you're not sure, do ask. And I don't know if this point comes up later, but if you're in the meeting and something comes up that you weren't expecting and you're not prepared for, it's completely fine to say, look, I'm not prepared for that topic. Could we come back and meet on that another time when I can have a little bit more time to prepare and think? Always important to find out who will be at the meeting. So will it just be you and the classroom teacher or the learning support or HOSE or the principal? Who's going to be there? And if there are more people than you, please consider taking along, which I think is the next one, a partner. Someone to be there with you and to take some notes. Now, think carefully about your choice of partner too. Sometimes it might be good to take your husband or your wife or your partner along, but sometimes they might not feel too comfortable with being there themselves. But if you've got a friend or somebody else that knows a little bit about advocacy, it can be good to have them there to take notes and just feel like there's a little bit more balance in the room when you've got many other people from the school there and just you. Always bring the focus back to your child and their needs. Sometimes in meetings it can drift off to the needs of the teacher or the needs of the other students. Always important to come back and say, look, this is what we're here for today, and making sure that we're getting things right for this little person or big person. As Lisa said before, remember you are an authority on your child. The decisions that are made in these meetings will impact you and your family, and especially your child, and will stick with you long term. And also important to clarify what will happen next. It's nothing more frustrating than a couple of weeks coming out of a meeting and feeling as though nothing from that meeting has been actioned on. So if you've got your person there taking notes, get them to note it down. Ask the school if they could send a follow-up email to say, look, this is what was decided on and this is how it's going to happen, and these are the people that are going to do it. One key tip from all of this, though, is to have a plan. As Lisa mentioned before, we can come at these things with a bit of humour, but the key important message is that it is a little child's life here, and we need to take that seriously. Think about your options beforehand, what your bottom line will be, and no doubt there'll often be times you need to compromise, but work out what it is that you're willing to compromise on. Okay, now that leads in quite well to dealing with anxiety, fears and doubts. So when meetings are coming up, when things are going not so well in the classroom, that's when those knots in the belly, the nights of sleeplessness and the doubts start to come across us. So we do have some tips here that we hope that are helpful. And hopefully we can share some more, and you're welcome to pop some things in the chat box if you've got some ideas as well. So we find it's always very good to return to your child's vision often. And I know for my son, when I head along to meetings, I actually take his vision along with us and I place it on the table. So it's there as a reminder to all to what we're working towards. Try to stay calm, but draw on strong emotion if you need. So, calmness is great, but there's times where you've just really got to express that this is really far too important for you to let go of. Talk with other parents who've gone before you. So if you've got some people that you know who have gone through the school before with a child with disability or in other schools, there's various groups that you can join. We have the QCIE, the Queensland Collective for Inclusive Education, who have regular catch-ups around Queensland and online that you can link with and talk to and work things through first with them before a meeting. Keep the positive memories close. I have a lovely poster of my son and all the wonderful things that he can do and enjoys hanging up in our lounge room. And I do turn to that when there's times when we've got the wobbles and we just need to remind ourselves of those positive times and what we want to get back to. There'll be times when you have to pick your battles. There'll be certain things that you just say, you know what, that bottom line, I think this is something that I might just be able to let go of, and we'll move on and work on something else at this time. Always so important though, after a meeting or when you're feeling exhausted, to try and find that time to relax and re-energize, do what you love, spend some loving time with your child. Taking that time, and especially during this time of COVID, I think we need that now more than ever. So advocacy is not something that parents typically seek. I've got someone there with a mic on. I might just get you to check your mics. If you can check your microphones are off. It can be emotional and exhausting. However, it can be a fruitful and empowering experience. Okay, I'm going to hand back over to Lisa, who's going to introduce some myths and facts that we're going to work through.
Okay, so I did want to say on that facing the crowd topic that I think it's really important as families that we actually are clear-sighted about what this advocacy journey is. So bluntly, it's going to be crappy at times. So as I said, I've been doing this for about a quarter of a century, talking to other families about inclusive education. And I don't think I know anyone who hasn't been through really hard times in the education system. I think it's really important helpful to think of it as actually advocacy for inclusive education as part of a broader civil and human rights struggle. So if we think about any great, human rights struggle, whether it was, women getting the vote or, people, the land rights movement in Australia or the civil rights in the US, none of those struggles happened without significant sacrifice. And sometimes I found it really strengthening to realise that I was part of the disability rights movement, actually, and that things that were happening to Sean weren't just happening to Sean. Unfortunately, they were happening because people with disability are still not accorded their rights in our culture. But we are on the right side of history, and by joining together, we are stronger. So just generally, it's really helpful to be clear-sighted about that, and to actually not feel depressed about that, but to draw strength from that. So none of us probably wanted to be, part of a movement for change necessarily, but there is something very uplifting about making a positive contribution, not just for your child, but for others. I would say accept those feelings of vulnerability. Find the dark humour. So find those people who you can call up and debrief that horrible meeting or that horrible email that you might have received. Embrace the gap between what you would like things to be and how they currently are, but never give up on the idea that your child deserves the very best that the world has to offer. So I guess the next activity about dealing with kind of propaganda, if you like, is because it's really helpful if you're going to be an advocate to know what you're really dealing with, to deal with. There's no power in procrastination. And sometimes I think we let ourselves be very afraid of what the other party is going to say, and that stops us from having the conversations or confronting people in the way that we need to. And look, there's many strategies that can help with that, but one strategy that I've found very effective is anticipating what is likely to be said at any particular point and preparing or rehearsing so that it takes the hurt or the possibility to be caught off guard out of the picture. So in I Choose Inclusion, there's a different version of this. So we really spent a lot of time, the group of parents who wrote I Choose Inclusion, and Glenys Mann was the person who brought it all together. And I think she was then doing her PhD. She's now a lecturer in inclusive education as well as a parent. So in I Choose Inclusion, you'll find some common statements and ways that families can respond to that. But since then, QPPD also took that further into a little kind of 3 or 4 page we call the Education Propaganda Directory, which many families have found very helpful. And this is an idea that you can recognise a non-inclusive mindset in some of the very common things that are said to parents, but you can do your own inclusive thinking and then come up with a response that's not combative, not aggressive, but is very clear about the rights of your child. So I think that's...
Yeah, I'll come over in. So what I'm going to take you through next is a little bit of a lead up to our next breakout room. We're going to have a look at what are some common myths and some responses that are provided there in that propaganda directory. And that propaganda directory is something you can access through CREW website. And I believe there's links in the I Choose Inclusion as well. So here's a myth for you. Your child would be best catered for in a special school. Now, we're going to say too, if you want to pop up a little something in the chat to be shared here, of like, oh yes, I've had that one thrown at me, or something like that, you're welcome to sort of join in the discussion on these slides. Of course, that's a myth. And here's a response that you might have ready in your mind, because this one is no doubt going to come up somewhere and someplace for you, whether it be family, friends or school. I've heard of no research to suggest that learning outcomes are improved in a special setting. And what evidence are you basing your recommendations on? And another myth. Our school doesn't have the funding for therapists and aides to support your child. It's a very common one that I've heard amongst parents, this one being said to them. Of course, a myth. I would be keen to talk about how my child can be supported to fully participate alongside their classmates. We aren't looking for therapy, and many of the supports shouldn't require funding or be specific to my child. Getting funding isn't something I can help with, but I'm happy to discuss how we can work further together. Your child won't have friends. I would hope that you will encourage my child to develop relationships with their peers. It would make it much harder for my child to make friends if they were removed from their local community. You are being unrealistic. I have known my child all their life. I know all that they have achieved so far. While there will be challenges, we need to focus on potential. I find it helpful to keep high expectations of them and what is possible. Your child won't be able to go on camp. It's too strenuous for them. Myth. Attending the camp is an important part of being at school. I want my child to participate. What can you put in place to adjust the camp activities and provide supports to ensure that they can take part alongside their classmates? Now, I believe that brings us to a point where Lisa and I are going to do a little bit of a demonstration for you of what we'd like you to do in the breakout rooms. So soon in your breakout rooms, we're going to send you off. We want you to take note of your breakout room number, and you're going to be broadcast a list of myths with a breakout room number, and then we're going to ask you within your group to do something similar to what Lisa and I are about to do. So Lisa's going to ask me a question, and we're going to pretend that we're, people in the playground, or with this one it would be a school meeting.
So Ainsley, we're really happy to have your son at the school, but you just need to be aware that the support that we can provide is going to be very minimal. Look, it's probably only going to be a couple of hours over the whole week. So I'm hoping that that's going to be acceptable to you.
Well, it is actually concerning, but I'd like us perhaps to have a bit of a more detailed conversation in regards to what sort of supports broadly might be available for my child that we might be able to bring in that aren't just teacher aid hours as well. I think there's many different ways that we can support and adjust to help him, and then we could perhaps look at what could be more possible with the other sort of paid supports.
Okay, so I guess what we saw Ainsley do is that she didn't just immediately go, yep, no, that's fine, even though that was obviously the intent of that question. She tried to change the topic to what will support look like, to change it about from hours of support to what accommodations would be like in the classroom. So you might just see the little example that is there.
We won't read through all that, but you can have a little look there at some typical responses that you might want to have ready at hand for such conversations, and that's what the propaganda directory does. It provides those for you.
So I think Ainsley is now going to ask me a question.
Oh, Lisa, look, we're just finding that the gap is getting wider for your son. We're getting up to these later years of primary school, and we're just a bit concerned whether this is the right place, the right way to be approaching learning for him.
Okay. So just I need to tell you that I'm stopping myself from silently screaming inside as I prepare my response. So look, I've actually noticed the gap. For me, I've always noticed a gap between how Sean is, his development and his peers. But the gap doesn't take away from his need to belong and participate and to be one of the gang with his peers. And so that's the important thing for us, is how to maximise his participation in the class. He's always going to have a lag in, between himself and his academics and his peers, but he has the same desire to keep learning and to belong to the class.
Okay. Well, I guess there with Lisa's discussion, it was acknowledging what the teacher was saying. Yeah, that's true. But guess what? It's not really going to be at the crux and turning it back to that importance of inclusion and why you're really there. That's why it's good to know what inclusion is really about and what it means for you and your family. Okay, so I think we're almost ready to head you off into your breakout rooms. So as I said, make sure you take note of which room you're in. We're going to broadcast a message which has those myths and the numbers of the breakout room. Take turns, and then we're going to come back, and we'd like you to share, if you can, what were some key points or things you found good or tricky in that discussion. We get to this point where we need to discuss, what do you do though when things go wrong, when you've had those issues at school and you're just not sure where to start. And I think a lot of parents that come to us at Crew are just like, where do I start? Like, I just can't let this one go. It's so important. So we always say it's always best to start where the problem or issue arose. So be that with the classroom teacher or with learning support. Start there if you can with a meeting. Make an appointment, prepare yourself first, take some notes, have a chat to some other friends that might assist you with preparing. Try to avoid that impulsive reaction, that heated email, that heated phone call or note to the teacher. You might just want to even just write that out first on a piece of paper and sit on it, and even share it with somebody that you know that you could trust to say, look, what do you think about this? And as I've said several times there, talk to a supportive friend or ally first. So if you're finding it difficult to get that traction happening at that level with the classroom teacher or learning support teacher, then yeah, it's probably time to have a talk to the school principal. And then we've got all sorts of other things that we have at your disposal that who you might need to connect with. We have QAI, who's in the same building as us. They've got some excellent information on advocacy that you can access there. There's internal reviews you can work towards, and there's information on the Ed Queensland website on the internal review process. But sometimes matters are so serious that they do require an external review, be that with the Ombudsman, the Queensland Human Rights Commission or the Australian Human Rights Commission. Now, it can be really confusing as to where to go first. There's information in our I Choose Inclusion booklet around the process and the stages and steps. And in Term 4, we've actually got some of the lawyers from QAI who are going to present a session all around this in more detail for you. Lisa, was there anything more on that you wanted to say? Okay, I think it's Lisa's turn to wheel on over, so I'm going to hand over to her.
Okay, so this is just like a summary, and then we'd love to bring you back and just kind of answer any questions that you may have, because we've kind of done a lot of things in the small groups, but we haven't had a lot of conversation in the big group. So look, as I mentioned before, there is value in being informed, and that was really the point of I Choose Inclusion, was trying to gather facts that people would need, so policy and legislation, kind of the understandings of inclusive education, so giving people the vocabulary, if you like, to advocate, to pass on advocacy strategies and tips, and I guess so people would feel strengthened with knowledge. So I would encourage people to keep learning about advocacy, to practice your skills, because it is something that's, we've just produced a beautiful booklet called Dreaming Big, Standing Strong. And one of the parents who contributed talked about advocacy as being like a muscle, that it kind of gets stronger as you practice, and that's certainly been my experience. And that to see advocacy not as a burden, but something that is actually a contribution to your son or daughter having the best possible life over the long term. So I was certainly not, I don't think I was a very strong advocate in Sean's early days. It took me a lot actually to speak up and to be clearer about what he deserved, but it is something that we can become better at. And probably my biggest tip, it has always been to connect with others who will inspire you with what's possible. So those people, I always say, a little bit further down the track are really helpful, as well as the people who are at the same kind of stage as your son or daughter, because it's helpful. We will have hard times, and it's helpful to be connected with others to stay hopeful, and knowing that inclusion is possible and knowing that you have people in your corner will help you to be the best possible advocate that you can be. We would definitely say there's been some, I just overheard some of the chat that Ainsley was involved with. I wasn't in a breakout group myself, but one of the things I know is that people are dealing with some hard stuff. So this is really just scratching the surface, if you like. So I would really encourage people. We've got a lot of other advocacy resources on our website, and we offer individual consultations. So we will definitely send out a follow-up email with a link to some of those resources, but I really encourage people to call us and have a fuller conversation. So our information today has been very general, but yeah. So we hope one day in the future to be able to offer face-to-face workshops again, but we will be working on some more resources and also supporting families to connect to their peers. So please stay connected with us. So this is my beautiful son at his Year 12 formal, not with the gorgeous girl he took as his partner, but with some other gorgeous blonde who he met there. And this is a quote that I contributed to I Choose Inclusion, which remains a favourite, I guess, message to you all. Dream big, stand strong. Be wildly proud of your precious child, and know that in choosing inclusion, you're making a difference, not just for your family, but for those that follow. So I would really encourage people to see advocacy, as I said, not as a burden, but as something that contributes positively to the world. So thank you very much. So thank you, everyone, and please stay in touch, and we look forward to supporting you into the future. Thank you.
Thank you.